to questions for the presenters. Anyone who has any questions, by all means, or comments? Yes, back.
Yes, I just had a comment in relation to Asian languages, and that is, in terms of Indonesian, the concern in Australia is the fact that now there are far fewer students matriculating or going through in Victoria, the VCE, than there were in the early 1970s, significantly fewer. So what that means is that the students who are coming through are less likely to have the skills to want to go on with Indonesian, and around the country, Indonesian departments have been closing. And this was a point raised by the David Hill report, who's Professor David Hill was at Monnet, and is now in Western Australia. So it's nothing to do with not being interested in Europe or whatever. It's actually about the fact that in terms of one of our significant nearest neighbours, that we're significantly less able to continue scholarship in that area of study.
I would also say that this goes back to the communication issue. I guess the curriculum, obviously the whole push of the national curriculum might rectify some of the problems, but I don't think there is enough awareness of why is it overall important to study a foreign language. Because some tend to assume that, oh, but people in other countries speak English. Whereas whoever has his own business or her own business, and whoever has tried to directly engage with other regions, whether it's Latin America, Asia, Europe, or any other Africa, any other region, would understand and appreciate how important it is to have not only the language understanding and knowledge, but also the culture and the setting. And I guess that goes back to the whole emphasis on how important it is to understand those intricacies about others in order to be successful. That's why our exporters from Australia have still faced enormous difficulties in trying to export overseas to EU, including to other regions, and they rely on a very small number of interlocutors who should attempt to help them. But some of my interviewees have suggested that Austrade, for example, which is an Australian government agency tasked with helping Australian exporters overseas, sometimes it's more, not always, but sometimes it's more hindrance than help. And sometimes they need to literally go to a foreign country and somehow by themselves find a way. Perhaps their expectations are too high. But that is also a communication strategy, I think, which needs to be applied and improved.
Can I just add that, oh, it's recorded, okay. That in the paper we had to work with, that I worked with Pascaline, I looked at the business schools and looked at the extent to which study of Europe specifically, but generally the outreach towards international type of studies from a business perspective. Because Professor Kaplan in 1990 said that the Australian manager was just not globally savvy enough to be able to deal internationally. And I'm not convinced that that much has changed in 20 odd years. What you tend to find, there's not much attempt at teaching, and we looked specifically at European studies in business schools. There's not much, there's a lot more focus on obviously China, Asia, because of our region. But there wasn't that much focus on understanding Europe, the EU, how you go about understanding, you know, a major trade block, for want of a better word, or in terms of influence. And yet most business schools were happy basically not to even register it. And so you looked at the programs and there was little. I just think that from a business perspective, and just adding to the point that was just made, there isn't, maybe because, well, everyone speaks English, and therefore that may be enough. It clearly isn't, but I don't see things having changed. You tend to find European studies in arts faculties, and you tend to see a strong focus on the politics and the international relations, and that is well covered. But when you look at, you know, business in the EU, I mean, the crisis happening in the EU at the moment, I'm not convinced it would be readily being addressed in a lot of business faculties. And I'm not sure what is required to change. We're trying a little within our EU centre here, but I think it's a long haul. It's not. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to make a general observation, if I may. I think that clearly there is lessons from the EU to be learned by Australia with respect, to models of democracy. Models of democracy itself is a big area where Australia has to learn and will have to learn to become a more politically sophisticated nation society here, but also because of surely our intention to integrate more and more with Southeast Asia. And in this area we can learn from the European EU experience, in the area of human rights, of religious, cultural differences, and of course in the very important area of immigration and refugee subjects. And so it is something that, because essentially we are a European nation here in Australia, we must pick up and learn from what has happened in the EU and apply that process to the very challenging task to make Australia integrate with our Southeast Asian neighbours, which have huge, issues of human rights, lack of democracy, very challenging. So here we are.
Yes. Sorry.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all three presenters for their very, very interesting presentations, and I know that they do reflect quite a lot of a research and a long history of scholarship, and I'd like to thank all three of you for giving us, in a sense, a snapshot of what you're working on. I just wanted to raise one or two issues. First of all, just in response to the last speaker, I don't think Australia is a European country, and neither do I think it's an Asian country. I think it's an Australian country which actually has quite a bit to teach Europe about multiculturalism, and quite a lot to teach many countries in Europe about tolerance. I think that certainly the European Union has been regarded as a potential model in some areas. I'm not too sure that's the one I would see as most perhaps relevant. The emphasis, I think, in some of what you're saying here reminds me of what I was listening to 20 years ago. That doesn't mean that things haven't improved, but I do think that we still have a challenge with, in a sense, what we could call the research policy teaching nexus, that we don't have enough input into policy, for instance, from our research and our teaching nexus. And I think that's a challenge. I mean, some of us have done that over the years. We've engaged with both the delegation and with DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I think that still remains an issue that actually needs more government engagement. With regards to the European studies issue, it's true that there's no specific degree on the EU. I actually don't think that's a problem. I think if it's part of an international relations or an international business set of offerings, I actually think that isn't bad at all, because it gives a good comparative context. And at a meeting of the European Studies Association of the UK, which, believe it or not, takes place in other parts of Europe every year, so in Passau last year, we had a discussion about this. I mean, really there is a trend towards individual subjects or courses or modules rather than particular degrees throughout Europe, particularly the two countries that actually have had a huge amount of them, and that is the UK and Germany. So I don't think, in a sense, we're outside of the trend. I think we're part of that trend. I probably would find it incumbent upon myself to mention the Contemporary Europe Research Centre at the University of Melbourne, because I think one of the things we did manage to do there was to have not just weekly seminars, or more often, not just 2 or 3 conferences a year, but to also engage with grants such as Jean Monnet grants, to have a huge number of publications that came about. And because we also dealt with Eastern and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union before many parts of those became members of the EU, I think that sort of expertise was drawn on. And I think that the history of European studies in Australia perhaps needs to consider more, and again, Pascaline both and I both work on this in different ways, really, in a sense, our understanding here of Eastern and Central Europe and Russia, in a sense, has been very, very pivotal to the understanding of Europe and more broad, and of the European Union. I'd also given the focus of the European studies on trade, that's very important, and I totally agree with Andrea Nicolai. But I think also the lawyers did get involved from the very beginning. Paul's right about the business aspect, but we had some good lawyers like Simon Bronnett and David McKinley involved in European studies from an early stage, probably early age too. So I just leave it at that, and I just wanted to compliment the excellent presentations, and thank you for those, and to Andrea's comments.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Question or comment?
Forgive me, my name's James Kaniki, and I don't mean to contradict the slides, but there is an Australian journalist in Brussels, and that's me. And I'm just out on holiday at the moment, and there's also a colleague of mine who's the editor of the New Europe weekly newspaper called Alia Papandreou. Unfortunately, both of us are over there on a European passport, which is why names don't show up in the stats, which are usually published by the lovely European Commission's accreditation manager, Pierre Soldati. I just wanted to say that when it comes to Australia's relationship with the EU, I wonder if DFAT and the Australian government might be to blame. I'm clearly not asking Nina for a comment because it might be a bit sensitive, but Brendan Nelson, the previous ambassador to the EU and to NATO, obviously had a military background. The current ambassador, who we all met at the Australia Day celebrations over in Brussels, lovely Duncan Lewis, who made a fantastic speech at our get-together just before we had to stand up and sing the Australian national anthem, even though no one could remember the words to it. He also has a military background. I wonder if there's too much emphasis on the NATO side of things and too little emphasis, I suppose, on the EU and maybe the possibilities that